All right, so I want to do a demo of the respiratory system using these models. And we'll start with this model right here. This is a mid-sagittal head model. So it's a head that's been cut right down the middle, mid-sagittally. And we're going to start with the respiratory tract in this space right here. This is the beginning of the respiratory system, the respiratory tract. And what do we call this space right here?
The nasal cavity.
Good, that's the nasal cavity. Here's the nose. This is what we call the nasal vestibules or the nostrils. Okay. And the thing to keep in mind about the nasal cavity is that there are two sides to it. Normally, there is a divider right down the middle. So you have a right side and you have a left side of the nasal cavity. And it's divided by what we call the nasal septum. Now, because this is right down the middle, it's basically cut right down the nasal septum. So you're looking at one side or the other. They basically remove the nasal septum in this view. Okay, so keep that in mind. What are these structures right here we find within the nasal cavity? Those are turbinates, also called nasal concha. Okay, nasal concha or turbinates. And what is the job, what is the purpose of these turbinates?
Humidify the air or warm it up.
Not directly, no. That is a job of the nasal cavity to warm and humidify the air. But what specifically is the job of these turbinates here? So you brought up a good point. The purpose of the nasal cavity and the upper respiratory tract in general is to, one, warm and humidify the air. But what's the other purpose of the upper respiratory tract? To filter air. Good, to filter air. And these concha, or these turbinates, are involved in that process. What are these turbinates going to do that are going to help the process? What do these turbinates do to air that moves into the nasal cavity? I'll say this, if these turbinates weren't there, air entering the nasal cavity would have a straight passageway back through the nasal cavity back to the throat.
Does it send them through different channels to be filtered?
Exactly. These turbinates basically make different channels and different convolutions, like we just saw on that nasal epithelium slide, all those different folds and whatnot. And what that means is instead of air having a straight shot back to the throat, it goes through these different folds and it gets thrown up against the wall of the nasal cavity. So large particles are able to come in contact with the wall of the nasal cavity. And so we can trap large particles and allergens and stuff like that. Does anybody know the bones that form these nasal turbinates? That's a tough one. Give you a hint. It's a bone that's forms a lot of the nasal cavity structure. It's kind of deep in the skull. It's the ethmoid bone.
Yeah.
Okay. So the ethmoid bone forms these upper turbinates, and then this lower turbinate is formed by, I think it's the inferior concha bone. So the point being is that there are bones that are forming these nasal concha. Okay. And since we're on that point, the ethmoid bone also forms the upper part of the nasal septum. Specifically, the perpendicular plate portion of the ethmoid bone forms the upper part of the nasal septum, then the vomer forms the lower part of the nasal septum. Okay. The respiratory tract is an open body cavity, which means it's lined by, which means it's a mucous membrane. Okay. And all mucous membranes are lined by epithelium. Does anybody know the epithelium that lines this mucous membrane?
I think that's the
Simple columnar. Columnar.
pseudocolumnar.
Pseudostratified, ciliated, columnar epithelium.
Sorry.
Pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium with goblet cells.
Oh.
What does the pseudostratified mean? Well, it means it looks like there's a stratification of epithelial cells, but it's really just one layer.
Yeah.
It's just a single layer. And you have cilia on top of those, on top of that epithelium, and there's also goblet cells in there. So what's the purpose of the epithelium? First of all, what are those goblet cells going to do? What's the job of goblet cells in here?
Produce mucus?
They produce mucus. This is a mucus membrane, and the goblet cells are going to be responsible for producing the mucus. And how is that going to help the situation? What does mucus do? Well, mucus is sticky, right? So that air that comes in there and gets thrown against the nasal cavity because of these the nasal wall, because of these turbinates, it sticks to that mucus layer. Okay, so the job of the mucus is to trap things. Now, do we want that mucus with dust and allergens and pollen and all that kind of stuff? Do we want that to stay there?
No.
We don't. Okay, so what is going to be responsible for moving that mucus out of the nasal cavity? That's where the cilia come into play. So the cilia are going to propel that mucus. Are they going to propel it forward out the nostril, or are they going to propel it back toward the throat? They're going to propel it back toward the throat. Okay, and at that point we can spit it out, hock a loogie, or we can swallow it and it goes into the stomach. Either way, we're getting rid of it. And when it's cold out, these cilia don't work as well. And that's why you tend to get mucus and whatnot that dribbles out of your nose when it's cold out, because these cilia are semi-paralyzed and they're not able to move it out the back of the throat. What are these right here, these spaces? Those are sinuses. We call those the paranasal sinuses. Para next to, and sinus are these cavities or these holes within bones of the skull. Do you know what this specific sinus is here?
Frontal.
Good, that's the frontal sinus because this is the frontal bone. And what about this one?
One of those, the maxillary? Or no, that's the other one.
No.
Starts with an L.
These are the sphenoid sinuses. The sphenoid sinuses. And the ethmoid bone that right here has a lot of air cells inside of it as well, okay, that are part of it. Then we have maxillary sinuses as well. And these sinuses are attached to the nasal cavity by small little channels, small little tubes that aren't shown there. And so they are connected. And let's just take a guess. What's the epithelium that's lining these sinuses? It's the same epithelium lining the nasal cavity. It's this pseudostratified epithelium. And so really what these sinuses are doing is they're increasing the surface area of the nasal cavity. So it's just more area to trap pathogens, trap bacteria, and do all that type of stuff. Good, so that's a good look at filtering air. The mucus is trapping that material, the cilia are taking it away. The other job of the upper respiratory tract is to warm and humidify air. And certainly that mucus is helping to humidify the air as well. But what about warming the air? Anybody?
Does it just filter through as a cycle and then gets shot back? Because it has to go through all the channels?
Yeah, so something that's not shown on here is right underneath the epithelium are a rich layer of capillaries. And those capillaries are bringing warmth to the nasal cavity. And so that air passing through the nasal cavity is going to warm it up. Okay. And the reason that we want warm air is because warm air holds more moisture than cold air. And by the time this air reaches the alveoli, the bottom of the lungs, the air sacs, it's going to be at body temperature, and it's going to be 100% humidified. And the reason we want it to be warm is because it holds more moisture, and air that's moisturized is less irritating to the lungs. Dry air is irritating to the lungs, and so we want moisture in there so it's not irritating to the lungs. Good.
Is that because during winter time, we need to have humidifier?
During winter, it's definitely drier.
Yeah.
And it can be irritating to the respiratory tract. And I certainly sleep with a humidifier in the winter to keep that humidity up. Yep, less irritating on the respiratory tracts. So then that air passes back through the nasal cavity, and it gets into this tube-like structure right here. And what do we call this tube at the back of the nasal cavity, back of the oral cavity, back of the larynx? What is this tube collectively called? That's the pharynx, or the throat. And the portion of the throat in back of the nasal cavity is called the nasopharynx. In back of the oral cavity is called the oropharynx. And in back of the larynx is called the laryngopharynx. Good. And it's basically the job of the pharynx to get that air down to the lower parts of the respiratory tract. Before we move on, what is this tissue right there? That's a tonsil. And tonsils are lymphatic tissue. It's lymphoid tissue. And inside lymphoid tissue are a bunch of white blood cells. And we have to keep in mind that this is an open body cavity, and so any pathogens that are in the air can potentially get inside the body through this mucous membrane, through the respiratory tract. And so white blood cells in these tonsils are basically, doing surveillance. They're surveilling for any potential pathogens that can come in. And also, right underneath the pseudostratified epithelium of the nasal cavity, in the areolar tissue immediately below it, are a whole bunch of white blood cells. Just in case, those pathogens can get through that epithelium, we're going to have a bunch of white blood cells there to alert the immune system of it. Just like the digestive tract that has a bunch of white blood cells right underneath the epithelium, the same goes for the respiratory tract.
So it goes all the way through, because we can see our tonsils. So it goes all the way through and then drops back after, or like mouth breathing.
What's the question?
Bacteria. So we have all of that, and then you have your tonsils.
Yeah, the tonsils are in the back of the. Well, this particular
so
one.
That's just like the leftover that does get through your tonsils are catching, correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Yep. Anything that gets through the nasal cavity, the tonsils are surveilling that air after it's done with that process.
Okay.
Good. Okay, so air travels down, travels through the oropharynx, the nasopharynx, oropharynx, and then we get down to this structure right here. What is this structure called right here? And this is made up mostly of cartilage, ligaments and cartilage.
Trachea? No.
We're not to the trachea yet. What's above the trachea?
Orange?
The larynx.
Yeah.
Okay, the larynx. And the larynx is made up of cartilage and ligaments. So this is cartilage, this is cartilage, this is cartilage. This is the thyroid cartilage on the front of the throat. You can palpate that. We'll look at that at the torso model. What's this little pad of cartilage right there? You should know that from the digestive system. It's part of the respiratory tract, but we talked about it in the digestive system. It was also on your lab ID list, which I know you guys went through all the structures on that. So.
No.
I'll tell you what, this is the entrance into the trachea. And when you swallow food, the tongue pushes back and it takes this structure and it tips it over and it protects the larynx so food doesn't go down the larynx.
Epiglottis?
It's the epiglottis. Good, so this is the epiglottis. What else do we have here? What are these little...
Vocal cords.
Those are the vocal cords or the vocal folds. And as air passes over them, it produces a buzzing sound, kind of like a duck call. But, as as that air passes up into the oral cavity and into the nasal cavity and into these sinuses, it gains what we call resonance. It becomes deeper, it becomes more distinguishable. But there's other structures involved to actually form words. That's where the lips and the tongue come in and you're actually forming the words. Good, so air moves down the larynx, and the epiglottis is by default, it's in an open position so that air can move down across the larynx and into the structure right below it, which is what? What's the next structure? The trachea, good. And the trachea is the beginning of the lower respiratory tract. Here's the spinal cord. Spinal cord comes up and becomes the brain stem. This is the medulla oblongata. Why is the medulla, why would I be pointing out the medulla oblongata with respect to the respiratory tract? What do we find related to breathing in the medulla oblongata?
Doesn't it stimulate something or sends a signal?
What do you call your normal unconscious breathing, which you guys are doing now? You're breathing without thinking about it. That's called eupnea. Okay, and it's like 12 to 15 breaths per minute. You're not thinking about breathing, but you're breathing. So where do those commands come from? Where do those breathing commands come from? Well, they come from what we call respiratory centers in the medulla oblongata. And they kind of work like the SA node in the heart, right? The heart beats on its own because the SA node spontaneously fires and sends signals for contraction. The same thing is going on in the respiratory center. It's generating these signals that are going to travel down nerves, the phrenic nerve and the intercostal nerve, to the respiratory muscles that are going to cause breathing to occur.
Yeah, I was gonna say reflexes, but that wasn't the correct term.
Yeah. So if you have damage to the brainstem, you might and it damages those respiratory centers, you may have to be put on a ventilator because you're not able to breathe on your own. All right, so moving on, we just got done with the upper respiratory tract. And in fact, the upper respiratory tract ends right here. What is this structure right here that we just talked about?
Trachea?
Contains the epiglottis, contains the vocal cords. That's the larynx.
Yeah.
Okay, this is the larynx. And these are the thyroid cartilages of the larynx, and you can go ahead and palpate those. They're these flat plates right below your chin, okay, on the superior part of your on your neck. And then the larynx gives way to the next structure, which is hidden behind the thyroid gland, but you can kind of see it back there. What is the next structure below the larynx? That's the trachea, also called the windpipe. And the trachea has these horizontal rings that are running across it. And what type of tissue makes up these horizontal rings that are running in the trachea? It's cartilage. Okay. So these are cartilaginous plates. They're C-shaped that wrap around the trachea. And what's the purpose of those cartilaginous plates?
To prevent collapse.
To prevent collapse of the windpipe, to keep an open airway. And in fact, as we go down further into the into the lower respiratory tract, we'll see cartilage, more cartilage wrapped around those structures. Okay. All right, so the trachea comes down, and at about mid-thorax, it branches. And we have a main branch right there, and we have a main branch right there. And what do we call this main branch coming off the trachea?
The starts with an H.
No?
The island? No. That is
It's the right main bronchus.
right.
This is the right main bronchus, which makes this the left main bronchus. And collectively, they're called bronchi. Bronchus is singular, bronchi is plural. So these are the main bronchi, are also called the primary bronchi. And these are the tubes that are going to enter the lungs. Okay. So I took the lungs off. But here we have the lungs. And the trachea branches, becomes the bronchi. And the bronchi are going to enter the lungs, and they do so. Let me see if I can get a close-up here. The bronchi enter the lungs through these slits, or these holes in the lungs. And what do we call these holes in the lungs where major vessels are going to enter and exit the lungs? That's the hilum. Okay, you guys have been waiting to say that word the whole time, so you can get that out of the way now. Good. So they go in the hilum. And not only do the bronchi pass through the hilum into the lungs, but what other major vessels pass through the hilum into and out of the lungs? We just got done with the cardiovascular system.
Arteries and veins.
The pulmonary arteries and the pulmonary veins. Pulmonary arteries going to the lungs, pulmonary veins coming away from the lungs. Good. And you notice with these bronchi, again, these bronchi have these cartilaginous rings around them. Okay. And so what's going to happen next is the bronchi enter the lungs through the hilum, then they're going to branch and branch and branch. And they branch about 23 different times. And they collectively form what's called the respiratory tree, or the respiratory tract. Actually, the respiratory tree is what we call it when it branches within the lungs. Okay. What is this tube right in back of the, well, it runs in back of the trachea, and then it continues on down here. What's this tube? That's the esophagus. Good. And lastly, at the bottom of the trachea right here, there's a little sensitive piece of cartilage called the carina. And any fluid or particles that make their way down the trachea, it stimulates that carina. And what happens next?
Cough reflex.
It stimulates a violent coughing reflex, because that fluid is not supposed to be down in the lungs. Okay. Put the heart back. So we can divide these lungs up into lobes. This is the right lung, this is the left lung. How many lobes does the right lung have?
3.
It has 3. 1, 2, 3. What about the left lung?
2.
It has 2. 1, 2. And so why is it that the left lung only has 2 lobes?
Heart beats space.
Yeah, the heart is a little left of center of the sternum, and so the heart's going to carve out a little bit of space there, right in this area. And so there's just a little bit less lung, and so there's only 2 lobes on that side. Okay, so just to recap, we have air that comes in the nasal cavity, gets thrown around by those turbinates. We filter air, we warm and we humidify air. It travels down the pharynx or the throat. Then it goes into the larynx, which contains the epiglottis and the vocal folds. Then it goes down the trachea, and the trachea have these cartilaginous rings that keep an open airway. And then about mid-thorax region, the trachea branches into the right main bronchus and the left main bronchus that enters the lungs through these slits called the hilum. And then what's going to happen is this is going to branch about 23 different times and collectively form what's called the respiratory tree. Okay? And if we want to take it just, each of these branches has a specific name. And if you get into the specialties of the lungs, if you become a specialist, you'll probably know all of those. But just to kind of continue on, after the right main bronchus, after the main bronchi or the primary bronchi, we have what are called the lobar bronchi. And these are the bronchi that are going to serve each of the different lobes. So there's 3 lobar bronchi on the right side. This is one here. That's one there. This is probably one there. And then we only have 2 lobar bronchi on the other side. Now, if you were to take a cross section of the lung and take histology of the lung, you would see a lot of these different tubes, a lot of the different tubes of the respiratory tree. And they're going to be all different sizes. And in fact, we did see that when we looked at the lung histology. You see different tubes of different sizes because you're cutting into different parts of the respiratory tree. But the majority of the lungs, the majority of the histology is going to be made up of these structures right here, these little air sacs. And what do we call these individual air sacs? Those are the alveoli. Good. So at the end of the respiratory tree, we finally get to the microscopic level. And this is the microscopic level right here. And does anybody know the name of the tubes that are microscopic? They're less than 1 millimeter in diameter that are going to feed the alveoli, these air sacs. They're the bronchioles. Okay, so these are the bronchioles right here. And by the time we get down to the bronchioles, something you'll notice is that the cartilage is pretty much absent at this point. And so we don't have cartilage, but instead we have this tissue right here that's wrapping all the way around the bronchioles. And what type of tissue is that? Epithelium lines the tract, but this is on the outside of the tract. What is this banded tissue right there? That's smooth muscle. Okay. And smooth muscle can constrict. And when it constricts, what happens to the diameter of the airway? It becomes smaller. And if the smooth muscle relaxes, what happens to the diameter of the airway? It widens. And why is that important? What happens to airflow if the bronchioles constrict? Pulmonary ventilation is the movement of air into and out of the lungs. What happens to pulmonary ventilation if the smooth muscle and the bronchioles constrict? It decreases. You have less airflow. And if they dilate, if they bronchodilate, you have more airflow. Good. What is the branch of the nervous system, the motor branch of the nervous system that's going to innervate this smooth muscle? The autonomic nervous system, both the sympathetic and the parasympathetic divisions. What are some situations that activate the sympathetic nervous system? What's that? Exercise. Exercise is a good one. So exercise is going to stimulate the sympathetic nervous system. What is the sympathetic nervous system going to cause this smooth muscle to do? To constrict or relax? It's going to cause it to relax. It's easy to say constrict because the sympathetic nervous system causes the smooth muscle in the blood vessels to generally constrict. But But the smooth muscle in the lungs is going to cause it to relax. It's going to cause it to bronchodilate so we get more airflow. Okay. And just the opposite with parasympathetic stimulation. Good. So the air moves down into the alveoli, the air sacs, and this is where gas exchange is going to occur. Okay. The point of the lungs of the respiratory system is to have gas exchange with the circulatory system. And so you have these capillary beds, these dense capillary beds that are going to wrap around the alveoli. And does anybody know the name of these capillary beds?
Pulmonary.
Those are the pulmonary capillaries. So the pulmonary arteries go from the heart and they move into the lungs, and then they branch and branch and branch, and they eventually become the pulmonary capillaries. And what's going to happen, what type of gas exchange is going to move here? What gas is going to move from the alveoli across the alveoli wall, which, by the way, is simple squamous epithelium? At this point, it's just these alveoli are made up of a single layer of simple squamous epithelium. They're super thin. And guess what? The capillaries are also made up of simple squamous epithelium. So you have two layers of simple squamous epithelium, one from the alveoli, one from the pulmonary capillaries, that are forming what we call this respiratory membrane. Okay, and it's super thin, which is nice because gases can just diffuse across that membrane. What gas is going to move from the alveoli into the pulmonary capillaries? Oxygen. And why does it do that?
Because it's going to the cells, the body. Yeah, it's going back. It's like high.
Why is oxygen going to move from the alveoli into the pulmonary capillaries? The oxygen doesn't have a brain of its own. It's not moving in there because it's like, I have to get to the cells. You know, what's actually causing oxygen to move from the alveoli into the pulmonary capillaries? What causes the movement of liquids and gases from one area to the next? Pressure. So the partial pressure of oxygen is greater in the lungs than it is in the capillaries, and so it diffuses across that membrane into the capillaries. I think the gradient is like 104 millimeters of mercury in the lungs to like 46 or something millimeters of mercury in the capillaries.
No, the opposite is true for.
So what
For CO2,
what gas moves from the pulmonary capillaries into the lungs? CO2.
because
And why does it do that?
Because there's less pressure in the alveoli now.
Exactly. And I think that's 46 millimeters of mercury in the pulmonary capillaries and 40 in the alveoli. So not a large gradient, but it's a gradient, and so CO2 moves from the capillaries into the lungs. And then we exhale that. Why do we need to move oxygen into the blood? What happens to that? Where does that oxygen go next? Well, it goes back to the heart, back to the left side of the heart, and it gets shot out the aorta. And where does that oxygen go next? Where ultimately is that oxygen going to get delivered?
Systemic tissue.
To the systemic tissue, but specifically the cells of the body.
Just all over, yeah. All over.
The cells all throughout the body. Why do the cells need that oxygen? For cellular respiration, to produce ATP. They produce CO2 as a byproduct of cellular respiration. And we need to get rid of that CO2 at the same rate that's formed. And that's why we're moving it from the blood into the lungs, and then we exhale it. What happens if CO2, too much CO2 stays in the blood?
Acidic.
It becomes acidic. Good.